Judge demanded Jasmine Crockett pay a massive fine, but she responded in a way nobody in that packed courtroom could have possibly foreseen. The air in hearing room 222 was thick with anticipation, a low hum of energy that settled heavily in the plush maroon carpet and clung to the polished wood of the dais. Every seat was filled, journalists' pens hovered over notepads, and the soft red glow of recording lights painted the scene with a perpetual, unnerving luminescence. Presiding was Judge Alton Sterling, a man whose reputation preceded him, sharp, often severe, and known for brooks no dissent from those he perceived as challenging the established order. His eyes, magnified slightly behind thick spectacles, scanned the room, finally settling on the woman seated at the witness table, her posture straight, hands resting calmly on the dark surface before her. Representative Jasmine Crockett. The tension wasn't new to her. It was a constant companion in these halls, a subtle pressure that sought to bend or break, but she had learned to move within it, almost become part of its fabric. Today, however, felt different. The specific weight in the silence was heavier, charged with something beyond the usual political theater. There had been weeks of this, hearings stretching on, veiled accusations lobbed like slow-moving grenades, procedural skirmishes designed to exhaust and frustrate. And through it all, her responses had been measured, rooted in fact, delivered with an unwavering composure that seemed to irritate her questioners more than outright defiance ever could. She had answered every inquiry truthfully, navigated every attempted trap, consistently bringing the focus back to the substance, the difficult, inconvenient truths that some in the room were desperate to bury. Now, the questioning had ended abruptly. Judge Sterling cleared his throat, the sound amplified slightly by the microphone before him. His gaze was fixed, unblinking. The silence that followed was profound, the kind where heartbeats feel audible. He spoke, his voice deliberate, resonant with the authority of his position. "Representative Crockett," he began, his tone devoid of inflection, formal and stark. "This court finds that your conduct throughout these proceedings has been obstructionist, has demonstrated a clear lack of respect for the process, and has caused undue delay and expense." He paused, letting the words hang, each one a carefully chosen weapon. Jasmine remained still, her expression unreadable, a mask of calm professionalism that had been honed over years in rooms just like this. On the monitor visible to the side, camera feeds showed tight shots of her face, waiting for any flicker of emotion, any hint of surprise or fear. There was none. Her gaze remained steady, meeting his directly, not challenging, but observing. "Therefore," Judge Sterling continued, the pitch of his voice rising almost imperceptibly, injecting just a hint of punitive finality, "pursuant to the authority vested in this court, and in consideration of the expenses incurred due to your unwillingness to cooperate efficiently, the court levies a fine, a substantial fine." He stated the number. It was enormous, a sum designed not merely to penalize, but to shock, to punish, to send a clear, unambiguous message. The number hung in the air, a staggering figure that immediately silenced the low murmur that had begun to build. It was a financial blow, yes, but everyone in the room understood it was more than that. It was an attempt to discredit, to financially cripple, to make the cost of speaking uncomfortable truths astronomically high. Jasmine's body did not tense. Her shoulders did not slump. Her hands remained still on the table. It was a masterclass in stillness, a profound refusal to grant the moment the satisfaction of visible impact. She didn't flinch. She didn't gasp. She simply registered the words, the number, the implicit threat behind it, and her internal landscape remained a fortress of calm. Around her, however, the stillness was not mirrored. Faint whispers broke out among the spectators. Reporters scribbled frantically. An aide seated just behind her shifted in their seat, a sharp, involuntary movement born of shock. The judge watched her, searching perhaps for the crack, the moment the pressure would show, but her face gave nothing away. The silence stretched again, longer this time, amplified by the collective holding of breath. It was her turn to respond, but she did not leap into speech. She allowed the weight of his words, the magnitude of the fine, to settle fully. She allowed the room to absorb the shock, This was not delay, it was a strategic pause, a quiet assertion of control over her own rhythm in a moment designed to throw her off balance. The message delivered by the judge was clear: cooperate or pay the price. And the price was steep, designed to make anyone think twice before daring to challenge the narrative again. But in her stillness, she conveyed a different message entirely. You may set the price, but you do not control the value I place on truth. The shock rippled outward from the dais, washing over the courtroom. Behind Jasmine, her chief of staff, Sarah, a woman whose normally stoic demeanor mirrored Jasmine's own, finally exhaled a breath she seemed to have been holding since the judge began speaking. It was a soft, almost imperceptible sound, but to anyone watching closely, it was a tell. It signaled the human reaction beneath the professional veneer that both women wore. Jasmine did not turn or acknowledge Sarah. Her focus remained entirely on Judge Sterling, her eyes steady, thoughtful. The silence after his pronouncement felt immense, a vacuum waiting to be filled. It was a moment ripe for an emotional outburst, a plea, a protestation of injustice. That was what the architecture of the moment seemed designed to elicit. But Jasmine remained seated, her hands now clasped loosely before her on the table. A small, controlled gesture. She was absorbing, processing, not just the number but the intent behind it. The fine wasn't about expenses, it was about silencing. It was a financial gag order, and in her stillness she was refusing the gag. She was refusing to play the part they had written for her, the defensive witness, the indignant politician. Instead, she occupied the space with a quiet power that seemed to grow with each passing second of silence. Judge Sterling's expression remained impassive, but there was a subtle tension around his eyes, a hint of impatience beginning to surface. He had expected a reaction, a challenge to his authority, something he could then shut down with procedural finality. Her composure was, in itself, a form of unexpected resistance. He tapped a pen lightly against the surface of his desk. The sound echoed in the hushed room. He leaned forward slightly. "Representative Crockett," he prompted, his voice still level, but carrying a new, sharper edge. "Do you have a response to the court's ruling?" It was a direct invitation to engage, to fall into the expected pattern of argument and defense. But Jasmine did not immediately accept. She took a slow, deliberate breath, her chest rising and falling almost imperceptibly. It was a small action, but in the charged silence it felt significant, a reclamation of her own physical and temporal space. Her gaze shifted for just a moment, not towards the judge, but slightly to the side, towards the packed rows of spectators and journalists. It wasn't a glance seeking validation or sympathy, but one that seemed to take in the full scope of the moment. The cameras, the faces, the weight of the public eye bearing down. It was a silent acknowledgement of the audience, a subtle signal that her response, when it came, would be for more than just the man on the dais. She straightened her already straight posture, a tiny adjustment that nonetheless conveyed strength. Her hands remained clasped, her fingers interlaced but relaxed. Sarah, behind her, watched with an intensity that mirrored the room's. Sarah knew Jasmine. She knew the steel beneath the calm. She also knew the deep sense of justice that motivated her, and the profound weariness that moments like these inflicted. This wasn't just politics. It felt personal, an attack disguised as procedure. Sarah's jaw was tight, but she kept her own stillness, taking her cue from the woman in front of her. The journalists were poised, pens ready, cameras rolling. They understood, perhaps better than some others in the room, the potential virality of this moment. A politician ordered to pay a massive fine in a high-profile hearing. It was clickbait gold, but Jasmine's unexpected lack of immediate reaction added another layer. It wasn't the expected outrage. It was something quieter, more dignified. And that, they sensed, might be the real story. The delay in her response wasn't frustrating. It was captivating. It built suspense. What would she say? How would she respond to such a clear, aggressive move? Would she falter? Would she fight? Or would she do something entirely different? The subtle shift in the room's energy was palpable, the initial shock giving way to a focused, intense curiosity. All eyes were locked on Jasmine, waiting for the first word, the first sign of what her unexpected response would be. Her composure wasn't just personal, It was becoming a performance of resistance, a silent counterpoint to the judge's loud declaration. And in that silence, her strength was becoming undeniable. The courtroom seemed to lean forward collectively, a physical manifestation of the heightened anticipation. Every subtle shift in Jasmine's posture, every controlled breath was magnified, scrutinized. Judge Sterling, sensing the shift in the room's energy, the turning of the tide of attention away from his decree and towards the witness who remained resolutely calm, spoke again. This time his voice held a note of impatience, thinly veiled authority demanding compliance. Representative Crockett, the court awaits your response. Do you accept the court's finding and the levied fine? He framed it as a simple administrative matter, a yes or no question designed to box her in. A yes would be capitulation. A no would be direct defiance, giving him further grounds for action. But the question, in its stark simplicity, ignored the complex dynamics of the moment, the blatant power play disguised as a procedural ruling. Jasmine finally spoke. Her voice was quiet, clear, and steady. It cut through the anticipation like a sharp blade, not loud but possessing an undeniable presence. Your Honor, she began, her eyes still fixed on his, a gaze that was neither challenging nor submissive, simply present. I have heard the court's finding. She paused, allowing her simple statement of fact to stand for a moment. It was not acceptance, merely acknowledgement. And I have heard the amount of the levied fine. Another pause. The economy of her words was striking. She wasn't arguing, wasn't defending, wasn't reacting in the way expected. Sarah, behind her, felt a surge of something akin to pride mixed with apprehension. This was vintage Jasmine, using stillness and precise language to control the narrative, even under immense pressure. The journalists were scribbling furiously, trying to capture every word, every nuance of her delivery. On the live feeds being broadcast, comment sections were exploding. The initial shock at the fine was quickly being replaced by commentary on her composure. Why isn't she freaking out? She's so calm. What is she planning? The quiet was building its own kind of momentum online. Judge Sterling's patience seemed to be wearing thin. His fingers drummed a faster rhythm on his desk. Yes, Representative, you have heard it. The question remains, do you accept it? And how do you intend to satisfy the court's order? He pushed for a direct answer, attempting to force her into a binary choice that would serve his purpose. This was the crux of the institutional power play, demanding compliance, demanding payment, using financial leverage to enforce silence and obedience. But Jasmine's response was already deviating from the expected path. She didn't address the acceptance directly, nor did she discuss satisfying the order in financial terms. Instead, she spoke to the premise, the underlying reason given for the fine: obstructionist conduct, lack of respect for the process, unwillingness to cooperate efficiently. Her response was calibrated not to debate the fine's legality, but to challenge the moral basis of the accusation that justified it. Your Honor, she repeated, her voice gaining a subtle, quiet strength. The court cites a lack of cooperation, an unwillingness to be efficient. She articulated the judge's own words back to him, not in a mocking tone, but with a simple, factual recitation that highlighted the disconnect between his description and her actual conduct. My conduct throughout these proceedings has been, at all times, truthful. My cooperation has been measured by the accuracy of my statements, not the speed or convenience with which I deliver them. Her gaze remained locked on his. It was a subtle reframing, shifting the definition of cooperation from passive agreement or speedy compliance to active engagement with the facts, however inconvenient they might be to the court's desired narrative. She was implying that his definition of cooperation was really a demand for capitulation or silence, dressed up in procedural language. The air in the room seemed to thin further. This was the turn. She wasn't fighting the fine. She was dismantling the justification for the fine. She was exposing the institutional attempt to penalize truth-telling under the guise of procedural violations. This quiet, intellectual dismantling was far more powerful and far more unexpected than any emotional outburst. The journalists' pens flew even faster. The live stream comments became a flood. People were starting to understand the game being played, and how Jasmine was refusing to play by its rigged rules. Her stillness was not passive. It was a deliberate, active choice, a refusal to be rushed, to be flustered, to be silenced. She was turning the very qualities they cited against her, her measured pace, her refusal to give easy answers, into evidence of her integrity, contrasting it with their demand for a convenient narrative. This was the subtle artistry of her approach, meeting immense pressure with quiet precision, using language not as a weapon of attack, but as a tool of clarity, exposing the hypocrisy with calm, undeniable logic. The tension in the courtroom was now a palpable force crackling in the air. Judge Sterling's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. He saw the direction she was taking. Not a direct challenge he could easily dismiss, but a foundational questioning of his premise, a subtle dismantling of his authority disguised as a simple statement of principle. His earlier attempt to force a financial compliance seemed to be losing its intended power, overshadowed by the moral clarity she was introducing. "Representative Crockett," he interjected, his voice sharper now, seeking to regain control of the narrative. "The court's ruling is based on observation of your actions, your persistent redirection, your refusal to give direct answers to direct questions." He attempted to reassert the narrative that she was being evasive or difficult, rather than truthful and precise. But Jasmine did not waver. She held his gaze, her expression calm, almost serene. Her quietness was an active force, a refusal to be drawn into the emotional noise. Sarah, watching from behind, felt a surge of admiration. It took immense discipline to remain this grounded, this focused, when facing such overt pressure and financial threat. She subtly nodded, a tiny movement of support that only Jasmine, if she were looking, might notice. The room was completely silent now. The only sounds the hum of electronics and the faint scribbling of pens. Everyone was waiting to see if the judge could force her back onto his ground, or if she would hold her own. Jasmine responded, her voice still quiet but carrying an undeniable weight. "Your Honor," she said, her tone respectful but firm. "My redirection was to the relevant facts when questions veered into speculation or misrepresentation. My answers, while perhaps not the desired answers, have been direct responses to the questions asked, filtered through the lens of truth as I understand it, and am sworn to uphold." She used his own words, redirection, direct answers, and redefined them, stripping away his negative connotations and imbuing them with her own meaning, a commitment to accuracy and integrity. She was not debating his perception. She was stating her reality, forcing the two into stark contrast. The court's finding appears to penalize not a lack of cooperation, but a refusal to collaborate in a narrative that diverges from the truth. This was it. This was the quiet, devastating turn. She wasn't just reframing. She was explicitly stating that the fine wasn't about procedure, but about punishing her for telling a truth that was inconvenient to the institutional narrative. It was a calm accusation of bad faith, delivered with the utmost dignity. It was the kind of statement that couldn't be easily shouted down or dismissed as disrespectful, because it was delivered with such composed precision. The phrase hung in the air, penalize not a lack of cooperation, but a refusal to collaborate in a narrative that diverges from the truth. It was a complex thought, delivered simply, hitting with the force of a delayed rhetorical hammer. It wasn't a soundbite designed for outrage, but a profound observation that exposed the core injustice of the situation. The journalists paused, their pens hovering. This was more than just a political moment. It was a moment of moral clarity injected into a system that often thrived on obfuscation. Onlookers in the public gallery exchanged wide-eyed glances. You could see the understanding dawn on their faces. This wasn't about a fine, it was about control. And Jasmine was quietly, powerfully, refusing to be controlled. Judge Sterling's face remained stern, but a flicker of something unreadable, perhaps surprise, perhaps frustration, crossed his features. Her response was so far removed from the expected indignant protest that it disarmed his prepared counterarguments. He had expected her to argue the legality of the fine, the fairness of the process, the burden it placed upon her. He had not expected her to articulate so clearly and calmly the underlying ethical conflict. This moment, the quiet assertion of integrity against institutional pressure, was the slow-burning core of the hearing, and it was reaching a critical point, fueled by Jasmine's unwavering dignity. The camera lights seemed to burn a little brighter. The hum of the room felt louder. Everything was zeroed in on her, waiting for the next quiet word that would carry the weight of defiance, not through anger, but through undeniable truth. The silence that followed Jasmine's statement was profound, weighted with the implicit accusation she had so calmly articulated. She hadn't raised her voice, hadn't expressed outrage, yet her words had landed with the force of a carefully aimed strike. Penalized not a lack of cooperation, but a refusal to collaborate in a narrative that diverges from the truth. The phrase echoed in the minds of everyone present, a concise summary of the power dynamic at play. Judge Sterling sat for a moment, seemingly processing the unexpected nature of her response. He had anticipated a battle over legal technicalities or financial hardship. He was faced instead with a quiet assertion of moral ground. His gaze intensified, searching for a weakness, a way to regain the upper hand. He cleared his throat again, the sound sharp and deliberate. "Representative Crockett," he said, his voice regaining some of its earlier authority, though tinged now with a defensive edge. "The court's finding stands. The fine is levied. Your characterization of the court's motives is noted, but it does not alter the ruling based on your conduct during these proceedings." He was attempting to dismiss her statement, to reduce it back to a simple matter of procedure and compliance. But the impact of her words had already spread beyond the immediate exchange. Behind her, Sarah met the eyes of another staff member seated nearby. There was a silent acknowledgement, a shared understanding that Jasmine had just cut to the heart of the matter. A subtle, almost imperceptible nod passed between them, a quiet gesture of support and recognition. In the public gallery, several people were now openly whispering, their faces reflecting a mixture of surprise and dawning understanding. The journalists were not just writing. Some were discreetly recording audio or video on their phones, recognizing that this particular exchange held significant potential for virality. Jasmine's statement wasn't a rant. It was a quotable line of devastating clarity. She had articulated the systemic issue, the pressure to conform to a convenient lie, in a way that resonated far beyond the specifics of the hearing. She held Judge Sterling's gaze, her expression remaining composed, unwavering. She wasn't backing down from her characterization, even as he attempted to dismiss it. "Your Honor," she replied, her voice still measured, acknowledging his statement without accepting its premise. "I understand the court's ruling stands, and I understand the financial imposition it represents." She acknowledged the practical reality of the fine, grounding the discussion back in the immediate consequences. But she immediately pivoted, linking the financial consequence back to the principle she had just stated. "The cost of this fine is significant, yes, for anyone." She paused, her eyes sweeping across the room for a brief moment, encompassing the media, the public, the entire spectacle. "But I have weighed that cost against the cost of silence." The room seemed to hold its breath. This was it, the unexpected response, the quiet, powerful statement that redefined the entire interaction. "And I find," she continued, her voice gaining a quiet, steely resolve, "that the price of silence when the truth is needed is far, far higher." She said it without flourish, without dramatics, just a simple, profound statement of personal value and ethical priority. "You can levy your fine," she concluded, her voice dropping slightly, returning to its earlier quiet tone, but imbued now with undeniable moral authority. "But you cannot levy a price on my integrity, or on the truth that the public deserves to hear." This was the viral moment, not a loud accusation, but a quiet declaration of moral independence. The price of silence, when the truth is needed, is far, far higher. It was concise, resonant, and flipped the script entirely. The judge's attempt to impose a financial penalty for perceived non-cooperation was met not with a defense of her finances, but with an assertion of her moral economy, where truth held a value that transcended monetary cost. It was unexpected because it bypassed the expected battleground, the fine's legality, amount, and elevated the conflict to a battle of values. The journalists looked up from their pads, some with expressions of awe. This wasn't just news. It was a powerful human moment unfolding in real time. a quiet act of defiance rooted in dignity. The comment sections on the live streams exploded with this line. It was being copied, pasted, shared, instantly recognized as the core message of the moment. Sarah, behind her, felt tears prick at her eyes. It was a perfect encapsulation of who Jasmine was and why this fight mattered. She hadn't yelled, hadn't attacked. She had simply stated her truth, and in doing so had rendered the judge's immense fine almost irrelevant in the face of a higher moral cost. The silence that followed this time was different. It wasn't just anticipation. It was the stunned silence of a room that had just witnessed a power dynamic profoundly shifted by quiet, unwavering dignity. The impact of Jasmine's words settled over the courtroom like a heavy cloak. "You can levy your fine," she had said, her voice quiet but resonating with absolute certainty. "But you cannot levy a price on my integrity or on the truth that the public deserves to hear." And then, the phrase that instantly became the core of the moment. "The price of silence when the truth is needed is far, far higher." Judge Sterling was visibly caught off guard. His stern facade wavered for a fraction of a second before being reimposed, tighter now, more rigid. He had been prepared for many responses: anger, legal challenge, perhaps even tears. He was not prepared for a calm, moral refutation that effectively stripped his financial penalty of its intended punitive power and reframed it as a failed attempt to buy silence. He tapped his pen on the desk again, a rapid, almost agitated rhythm. The deliberate pace he had set earlier was gone. His gaze, though still fixed on Jasmine, held a new frustration. He seemed unsure how to proceed. Her response wasn't a point of law he could argue against, or an emotional outburst he could dismiss as histrionics. It was a statement of ethical principle, delivered with such quiet conviction that it felt unassailable. "The court's concern," Judge Sterling began, his voice slightly strained, attempting to pull the focus back to his narrative, "is with the process, with compliance, not with your personal valuation of truth." He tried to sever the link she had made between the fine and the suppression of truth, but his denial felt weak against the strength of her assertion. Jasmine remained still, allowing his words to pass over her without visibly reacting. Her composure was maddeningly effective. She wasn't debating his points. She was existing in a different space entirely, a space defined by integrity rather than procedure. Sarah, behind her, risked a quick glance at the press row. Their faces were a mixture of focused intensity and something akin to awe. They knew they had just witnessed a viral moment being born. Phones were out, capturing snippets, live tweeting the exact quote. On the monitors visible in the room, the sudden surge of online activity was evident. Hashtags appearing, mentions skyrocketing. The quiet dignity of her response was proving to be far more potent in the public sphere than any loud confrontation could have been. The phrase "price of silence" was spreading like wildfire. It resonated with people who understood the pressure to stay quiet in the face of injustice, who felt the weight of institutional power trying to dictate narratives. It turned a dry procedural hearing into a compelling human drama about courage and truth. Judge Sterling, sensing the momentum shifting inexorably away from him and towards the woman who refused to be intimidated, finally resorted to a show of finality. "Very well, Representative," he said, his voice clipped. "Your response is noted. The fine stands. The court is adjourned." He struck his gavel with sharp finality, the sound echoing in the suddenly chaotic room. As the judge rose and exited the dais, the quiet tension in the room broke. Journalists swarmed forward, trying to get closer to Jasmine. Spectators murmured loudly, some pointing, some looking visibly moved. Sarah immediately moved closer to Jasmine, a protective presence. Jasmine rose slowly, gathering her few papers. Her movements were deliberate, unhurried, maintaining the same calm dignity she had displayed throughout the hearing. She hadn't won a legal battle in that moment. The fine remained. But she had won something perhaps more significant. She had redefined the battleground, moving it from the ledger book to the moral landscape. Her unexpected response hadn't been about escaping the penalty. It had been about stripping the penalty of its intended power to silence. By stating that the cost of silence was higher than any financial fine, she had rendered the judge's action morally bankrupt. The virality of her quote wasn't accidental. It was the natural consequence of articulating a fundamental truth about power and integrity in a moment of immense pressure. Her quiet strength had transformed a punitive measure into a public demonstration of principle. As Judge Sterling exited the courtroom, the structured formality of the hearing dissolved into a controlled but undeniable buzz of activity. Journalists pressed forward, microphones extended, eager to capture Jasmine's immediate reaction now that the official proceedings were over. But Jasmine did not rush to the microphones. She stood for a moment beside the witness table, gathering her belongings with the same measured calm she had maintained throughout the hearing. Sarah was right beside her, a silent shield, helping organize papers, exchanging brief, knowing glances with other staff members who now surrounded them protectively. There was a sense of quiet victory in their small circle, not of having defeated the system entirely, but of having navigated its attack with integrity intact. The viral quote was already out there, spreading rapidly online. The phrase, "the price of silence when the truth is needed, is far, far higher," was appearing everywhere, in tweets, news headlines, shared on social media platforms. It was being clipped from the live stream, replayed, analyzed. People who knew nothing about the specific hearing were sharing the quote because it resonated with a deeper truth about courage and speaking out. The narrative was already being reframed in the public eye. The initial news of a large fine levied against a politician was quickly being overshadowed by the story of why the fine was levied, or appeared to be, and the dignity of her response. Commentaries were emerging that highlighted the apparent attempt by the institution to silence her truth-telling, contrasting it sharply with her unwavering commitment to principle. The fine was no longer just a financial matter. It was a symbol of institutional overreach, and Jasmine's response was becoming a symbol of moral resilience. As she slowly moved towards the exit, flanked by her staff, a few journalists managed to call out questions. "Representative Crockett, your response to the fine? Do you plan to appeal? Was the judge's ruling politically motivated?" Jasmine paused briefly at the door, turning to face the gathered press. Her expression was calm, not triumphant, but resolute. She didn't offer a lengthy statement, didn't engage with the specifics of the questions about appeal or motivation. Instead, she offered a brief, impactful response that continued the narrative she had established during the hearing. "My statement in the courtroom," she said, her voice clear and steady, audible even over the low roar of the crowd, "reflects my position. My duty is to the truth, and that duty outweighs any financial penalty imposed for upholding it." She paused, letting the simplicity of the statement land. It was another version of the viral quote, reiterating the core principle. "We will, of course, address the court's order," she added, acknowledging the procedural reality of the fine, but deliberately keeping the focus on the principle rather than the payment. "But the message I delivered today is the most important part of these proceedings." With that, she turned and exited the room, leaving the journalists to dissect her brief, powerful remarks. Her departure wasn't a retreat. It was a strategic withdrawal, allowing her words and the virality they had generated to do the work. She didn't need to argue further. The moral clarity had been established. The moment was no longer just about the fine. It was about the quiet power of speaking truth to power, even when the cost was made explicitly clear. The images of her calm face under pressure, coupled with her resonant words, were now the dominant story, eclipsing the judge's attempt to use a financial hammer to control the situation. The public re-evaluation of what had happened was swift. Social media was flooded with praise for her composure and her courage. Memes incorporating her quote appeared. Debate sparked, not about the technical validity of the fine, but about the ethics of using procedural power to suppress inconvenient truths. Her restraint, her refusal to engage in an emotional battle, was widely interpreted as a sign of strength and moral superiority. She had taken the hit, the large fine, but her unexpected, dignified response had transformed it from a mark of punishment into a badge of honor, a testament to her unwavering commitment to truth. The emotional ripple effect from the courtroom moment extended far beyond the immediate aftermath. Back in her office later that day, the atmosphere was different. There was still work to be done, calls to return, strategies to discuss regarding the levied fine. But there was also a quiet pride. a sense of vindication that transcended the immediate financial challenge. Sarah watched Jasmine sitting at her desk, reviewing documents, the picture of calm professionalism. It was hard to believe that just hours earlier, she had faced down a significant financial penalty imposed in a public, tense setting, and had done so with such profound dignity. The news cycle was dominated by the story. Cable news dissected her response. Online articles analyzed the implications of her price of silence quote, and social media continued to amplify her message. The debate had fully shifted from the technicalities of the hearing to the fundamental questions of truth, power, and the cost of dissent. Many commentators highlighted her composure as a key element of her strength, noting that she hadn't given the judge or her adversaries the satisfaction of seeing her flustered or defeated. Her refusal to be drawn into an emotional fight was framed as a deliberate, strategic choice that ultimately disarmed the attack. Sarah brought her a cup of tea, setting it gently on the desk. "They're calling it the quote of the year," Sarah said quietly, referring to the viral line. Jasmine looked up, a faint, tired smile touching her lips. "It wasn't about the quote, Sarah," she replied softly. "It was about the truth behind it." Sarah nodded, understanding. For Jasmine, the resonance of the words wasn't about personal fame or virality. It was about the message landing, about people seeing the attack for what it was and valuing the integrity of the response. They discussed the next steps regarding the fine, legal options, potential fundraising if needed. But even as they spoke of the practicalities, the conversation was imbued with the context of the day's events. The fine was still a burden, a consequence of speaking out, but it felt less like a punishment and more like an expected cost in a system rigged against truth-tellers. The dignity with which she accepted that cost, while simultaneously articulating the higher cost of not speaking, had fundamentally altered its meaning. The public reevaluation was ongoing. People who had previously been indifferent to the hearing, or even critical of her, were expressing newfound respect. Her unwavering posture under pressure, her refusal to yield her moral ground, resonated deeply with those who felt similarly pressured in their own lives. It was a powerful demonstration of restraint as strength, of finding power not in aggression, but in grounded, quiet conviction. The emotional ripple wasn't just public, it was internal for those who worked with her. They had seen the relentless pressure, the subtle and not so subtle attempts to wear her down, and to see her emerge from such a direct attack not just unscathed, but having landed such a profound countermessage, was inspiring. It reinforced their belief in the importance of their work and the value of fighting for truth, even when the system tried to make it prohibitively expensive. Jasmine took a sip of her tea, her gaze distant for a moment. She was reflecting, processing the weight of the day. It was exhausting to live under such constant scrutiny, to face attacks disguised as procedure. But moments like the one in the courtroom, where she had been able to cut through the noise and speak a simple truth that resonated, made it feel worthwhile. The fine was a tangible cost, but the feeling of having stood firm, of having articulated the higher value of truth in the face of pressure, was an intangible reward that far outweighed the financial burden. The day had been a stark illustration of the themes that defined her work. Microaggression escalating to overt attack, the institutional forces seeking to enforce conformity, and her own unwavering commitment to dignity and truth as the ultimate forms of resistance. The institution, embodied by Judge Sterling and the forces he represented, found themselves in an awkward position. Their attempt to use a procedural and financial hammer had backfired, spectacularly. The massive fine, intended to be a punitive measure that would silence or cripple, had instead become a symbol of their overreach, a testament to the length they would go to punish someone for speaking inconvenient truths. The viral quote, "The price of silence when the truth is needed is far, far higher," had effectively inoculated Jasmine against the intended impact of the fine. It wasn't just a clever line. It was a moral framework that reframed the entire conflict. Now, any further action they took regarding the fine risked reinforcing the public perception that they were indeed trying to buy silence, validating Jasmine's powerful statement. There were reports of internal discussions within the institutional circles involved. Some argued for doubling down, for enforcing the fine rigorously to show that their authority could not be undermined by rhetoric. Others, however, recognized the public relations disaster that was unfolding and argued for a more nuanced approach, perhaps seeking a way to quietly mitigate or delay the fine without appearing to back down entirely. Judge Sterling himself remained publicly silent after the hearing, his stern pronouncement overshadowed by the ripple effect of Jasmine's response. His authority within the courtroom, while legally absolute, had been morally challenged, and, in the court of public opinion, perhaps diminished by the perceived unfairness of his action contrasted with her dignified response. The media coverage continued to highlight the moment. Analysts discussed the strategy behind Jasmine's calm, unexpected response. Legal experts debated the procedural grounds for the fine, often finding them tenuous or unusually severe. The public conversation wasn't just about the legality of the fine, it was about the ethics of using legal power to suppress dissent and truth-telling. Jasmine and her team navigated the aftermath with careful deliberation. They explored legal avenues to challenge the fine, not necessarily with the expectation of overturning it entirely, but as a further demonstration of their commitment to due process and principle. However, the focus remained less on the technical fight against the fine itself, and more on reinforcing the narrative that had resonated so deeply with the public, the fundamental importance of truth and integrity. They didn't launch a public fundraising campaign specifically to pay the fine, although offers of support poured in. To frame it as needing public money to fight the fine might dilute the message that the cost was ultimately hers to bear, a price she was willing to pay for principle. Instead, their messaging continued to center on the substance of the issues she had raised in the hearing and the importance of protecting the ability to speak truth without fear of retribution. Her composure remained her superpower. In subsequent interviews and public appearances, she didn't dwell on the personal hardship the fine represented. When asked about it, she calmly reiterated her stance, reinforcing the idea that while the financial cost was real, the moral cost of silence would have been intolerable. This consistent, dignified approach prevented the narrative from devolving into a simple tale of political persecution and kept it focused on the higher principles at stake. The institution's move to silence her had, through her unexpected response, amplified her voice instead. Their attempt to penalize her integrity had, paradoxically, showcased it to a wider audience. The quiet strength of her stance had defeated their aggressive move, not by fighting on their terms, but by elevating the conflict to a plane where their procedural weapons held no power against the simple weight of truth and dignity. The institutional forces had sought to exert control through financial pressure, but Jasmine had demonstrated that some things, like integrity and the truth the public deserved, were beyond price. In the quiet hours after the storm of attention had somewhat subsided, Jasmine sat alone in her living room, the city lights a distant blur outside her window. The day had been a marathon. The tense hearing, the surge of media attention, the countless messages of support, the urgent discussions with her team about next steps. The fine remained a reality, a significant financial burden that would need to be addressed. It wasn't a small matter, despite the powerful narrative that had emerged. But as she sat there, the weight of the number felt different now. It wasn't just a penalty. It was a tangible representation of the cost of speaking uncomfortable truths in rooms where powerful people preferred silence, and she had consciously chosen to bear that cost. She thought back to the moment in the courtroom, the judge's stern face, the stunned silence after the number was announced. She remembered the flicker of surprise in his eyes when her response wasn't what he expected. Her choice hadn't been impulsive. In those stretched seconds of silence, she had weighed the options. She could have expressed outrage, appealed to fairness, highlighted the burden. All valid responses, perhaps, but she had sensed that none of those would truly capture the essence of the moment. This wasn't just about her. It was about the systemic pressure placed on anyone who dared to challenge a carefully constructed narrative. It was about the attempt to make integrity prohibitively expensive. And so, she had chosen to speak not just to the fine, but through it. She had used the moment of maximum pressure to articulate a fundamental truth about value, the value of truth versus the cost of silence. Her hands, which had rested so calmly on the table in the courtroom, were now clasped loosely in her lap. They felt steady. There was a deep exhaustion, yes, but also a profound sense of peace. She hadn't compromised. She hadn't buckled under the pressure. She had faced the institutional attack with the only weapon she truly needed, her unwavering commitment to truth, and her quiet, unshakable dignity. Sarah had sent her a text earlier. "You changed the conversation today. More than changed it. You elevated it." That resonated. That was the unexpected outcome. The intent had been to punish and silence. The result had been an amplification of her voice and a widespread public discussion about the very principles she stood for. The viral quote wasn't just a fleeting internet moment. It had become shorthand for standing firm against pressure, for valuing truth above convenience or cost. It was a reminder that power wasn't just about who levied the fines or controlled the proceedings. It was also about who controlled the narrative, who could inject moral clarity into moments of obfuscation, who could maintain their dignity when others sought to strip it away. The financial battle might continue, but the moral victory had been secured. She had demonstrated, for everyone watching, what it looked like to hold on to your integrity when facing a system designed to make you compromise. She had shown that the price of silence was indeed higher. If this story moved you, share it. Not to go viral, but to remind people what dignity looks like.